Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to discuss William James's The Will to Believe. And as I go through it, I want you to think of its applicability to the notion of engineering ethics.
Let's look at William James here. What does he say? Well, like I said, this piece is a little bit different from Clifford's because it's a speech, and he has a lot more to talk about the notion of faith. Okay, and faith is a word that gets employed a lot in religion and philosophy, and it seems to me often that there is ambiguity as to what it means. In the Christian sense, faith, where the word faith is often employed, the Greek word is, the verb would be pisteo, which is related to our word epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. Faith is often related to the word knowledge. Like, to have faith in something is to know something. And even in a Christian conception, it's to know it intimately. So, for example, in the sayings of Jesus, where, someone, I think this is one of the Gospels, where someone says, Jesus is giving a parable about on the last day, people will say things like, well, we cast out demons in your name, we did this, that, and the other, and he will say, I never knew you. That word know relates to an intimate knowledge. Like, Jesus knows who you are in this take, but he doesn't know you. Like, there's not an intimate knowing. Kind of like how Adam in the King James Version of the Bible knew his wife Eve. It wasn't like hey, they happen to know each other. There's a sense in which that implies a kind of intimacy. Faith also in a Christian conception involves this kind of intimacy. To have faith in God, for example, is not simply believe that some divine being out there exists, but to know this God. So faith from this kind of Christianesque conception involves a kind of knowledge. And often faith involves a kind of trusting. To have faith in something is to almost rest on it. Like, imagine yourself, you're leaning on a rail. If you lean on let's say you're out doing something, you lean on a rail, there's a sense in which you have faith that the rail is going to support you. This is also an aspect of the Christian conception of faith, or again, pisteo, in Latin, fides, that faith is both an intimate knowing, but also kind of a leaning on in a trustful sense. It means both those kinds of things. Now, take it out of the theological conception. What would that mean in a philosophical or an epistemological conception? To have faith in something or some belief is to be able to rest upon it, but also, in a certain sense, to kind of know it in some kind of way, even if it's not an inductive knowledge, like we would think of a scientific knowledge. We know that, say something like, we know that the Earth is the third planet in the solar system. It's not just a matter of faith, but based on evidentiary findings, we can assert that claim, and also that claim can be demonstrated. When something is a claim rooted in faith, in this conception, it's not something that can necessarily be demonstrated in the same way, but that there are grounds for believing it. If you want to look at a more modern take on this in the 20th century, I say look at the work of Alvin Plantinga. So let's take a look at how William James is going to start this piece. He says here in his introduction, I have brought with me tonight something like a sermon on justification by faith. Now that's a Christian conception referring to one being kind of the word justified here, dikaiosune, in the Greek New Testament. To be justified by faith is that because of whatever the accomplishments of Jesus in his life, death, burial, and resurrection, as Christians purport, transpired, that the correct faith in that series of events therefore justifies the believer in Christ in a sense of making them right before God, basically making them just before God, not because of what the individual, the believed, the person who's saved, not because of what they did, but because of what Christ did. Notice he doesn't say justification by faith, he says justification of faith. It's going to be like a sermon, he says it's going to be like a sermon on justification by faith to read to you. I mean an essay in justification of faith, a defense of our right to adopt a believing attitude in religious matters, in spite of the fact that our merely logical intellect may not have been coerced. The Will to Believe, accordingly, is the title of my paper. So this is a paper, like I said, it's a paper, it's a speech that he's presenting. He kind of read off this, and he's taking kind of the Christian notion of justification by faith and turning it into a justification of faith, which he says a defense of our right to adopt a believing attitude in religious matters in spite of the fact that our merely logical intellect may not have been coerced. For the purposes of this analysis, you can take out the notion of it being simply relegated to religious matters. I want you to think of the justification of faith being a defense of our right to adopt a believing attitude in spite of the fact that our merely logical intellect may not have been coerced. Okay, so that we have what I want to focus on James saying here is that we have a right to believe things, and that we should believe things where 100% of the evidence is not in. And if you were reading Clifford and got a feeling that, well, yeah, it's dubious to believe things when we don't have 100% of the evidence, or if we're not completely certain, we should keep our mouths shut. Juxtapose that with what James is saying here. Now, he gives a little bit more to his introduction, but I want to get into it. Section 1, this is on page 194. James says, let us give the name of hypothesis to anything that may be proposed to our belief. Like just anything that we can believe, let's just call it a hypothesis. Does that mean it's a scientific hypothesis? No. Just anything that we believe. You might call it a thesis, you might call it an assertion, you might call it a proposition. Just anything you believe, let's call it a hypothesis that can be proposed. And just as the electricians speak of live and dead wires, so if you've ever done anything with electricity, and it's something as simple as, if you go to your fuse box, let's say you want to replace a power outlet in your house, you probably want to turn off go to the fuse boxes and turn them off. You know that there's a difference between a live wire and a dead wire. James says just take that. Now, a live hypothesis is one which appeals as a real possibility to him to whom it is proposed. If I ask you to believe in the Mahdi, that's kind of an Islamic savior figure of sorts in certain Islamic traditions. Most Christians are probably not going to do that, which is James's audience here. The notion makes no electric connection with your nature. It refuses to scintillate with any credibility at all. As a hypothesis, it is completely dead. To an Arab, really he should say Muslim here, even if he be not one of the Mahdi's followers, the hypothesis is among the mind's possibilities. It is alive. This shows that deadness and liveness in an hypothesis are not intrinsic properties, but relations to the individual thinker. So, I think this is important for James. What James is saying here is that if you already have an affinity for something, if someone makes a hypothesis or makes a claim or a statement about something to which you either already have an interest, it could be a curiosity, it could be a vested interest, you're more likely to perk up when someone says something about something for which you have an interest in. So if you're not a Muslim and someone starts making claims about Islamic philosophy or theology, here's some claims about the Mahdi. Well, if you're not a Muslim, you're probably not going to care. But if someone begins making, let's say you're a Christian, and someone begins making claims about the nature of Christ isn't fully God and fully man. There's no such thing as the hypostatic union. Let's say someone who purports to be a Christian makes this claim. For the Christian, this all of a sudden becomes a much more palpable claim. That is, there's a lot more feeling to it. You have a much more vested interest in it. And it need not be about these theological and philosophical matters. It might be about something more mundane. Let's say you're into a particular kind of music, and someone says, hey, that person, they stole their music from this other artist. Okay, if you have no idea who the artist is, and this is something where, as you get older, you will find this happening. It's a weird thing. When I was in high school, even all the music that I didn't like, I knew all the artists. And then when you hit about 25, this thing starts to happen, where there's up-and-coming musical artists, and people will name drop, and you'll have no idea who they're talking about. This is just a feature of getting older, and it's embarrassing. So someone will occasionally mention, and I'm someone who likes to stay up to date with music. It's something I really enjoy, and I like a lot of up-and-coming artists. But someone will mention a musical artist, and I will have no idea who they're talking about. And then I'll Google it or something and find out this is one of the most popular artists in the world. It's embarrassing, but it's something that happens. But if someone mentions something about an artist, say that you like, all of a sudden that hypothesis, that claim, will be of more interest to you. It's live for you, and that's simply what James is saying at this point. That hypotheses are live for us. I'm somebody who does philosophy. When I hear people make philosophical claims, that's live for me. All right, I get into it, even if it's something I think I agree with or I think it's stupid. Someone makes a claim in philosophy. My specialty is the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard. Someone mentions Soren Kierkegaard, I perk up. If someone mentions a philosopher that I don't care about, I'm less likely to perk up. So if someone says something about, say, I don't know, who would be my least favorite philosopher? Alive, someone who purports to be a philosopher, Stefan Molyneux, Alain de Botton. If someone makes a claim about them, I'm probably not going to care, because I'm not going to look at it anymore, because I don't really care about them very much. I don't like their work very much, so I really don't care. But that is what James means by something being a live or a dead hypothesis. Will it stir up kind of meaning for you, whether or not you agree or disagree with the claim being made? Does it kind of tantalize you when you hear it being done? This is the first feature that he thinks is important when we're talking about various hypotheses or claims. This shows that deadness and liveness in a hypothesis are not intrinsic properties, but relations to the individual thinker. Claims that are made, it's not something, is the claim itself a hot topic or not. What makes something live or dead is not the topic or the claim itself, but its relation to the hearer, is what James is saying. And what this does is it follows it up by it's measured by his or hers willingness to act. So you hear a claim being made, does that perk you up? Do you want to say something about it? Okay, if someone says something about, again, a musical artist, an actor, an author that you like, someone makes a claim about them, this person, they suck. Okay, whoa, how dare you say that? You might be someone who's an apologist for this person or a defender of this person. How does that, if it perks you up, that's going to change your activity or your actions. If it's someone you've never heard of, on the other hand, you go, oh, that's interesting, I guess. That's what James is saying at this point, that sometimes our attitudes about truth claims are contingent upon sometimes our familiarity with it, our interest with it, and our applicability to it. What draws us in to certain kinds of claims is the affinity that we already possess for it. And that means, he says here, practically, that means belief. But there is some believing tendency wherever there is willingness to act at all. So our will to believe is contingent upon our affinity for whatever topic is at hand being discussed. So that's one criteria you can think of. You can think of when it comes to beliefs and assertions and our willingness to believe things is it live or dead for me? Does this matter to me or does it not? It's the simplest way I can put it. Is this something I care about or is it something I don't care about? And if it's something I don't care about, I'm not going to deal with it any further. If it's something that I do care about, then there's other considerations that need to be made. Next question. Let us call the decision between two hypotheses an option. That is, what are you going to do with it? Once you take up something of interest, what are you going to do with it? He says options may be of several kinds. They may be living or dead. We already talked about that one. Forced or avoidable. And momentous or trivial. And for our purposes, we may call an option a genuine option when it is of the forced, living, and momentous kind. So a real option, that is when we have to make a real decision about really believing something, is when it hits the first check mark in any of these three dyads. So we got 3 bits going on, and he hasn't defined them yet. He is going to define them sort of here in a moment. So living or dead. Okay, so does it interest you or do you not care? And usually if you don't care, you're just going to throw it away and you're not going to go about this any further. Let's assume it's something that's interesting to you. Okay, or you kind of perk up. The second the second filter that it goes through is this. Is it forced or avoidable? So once you get to the point where like, oh, that interests me, is this something, do you have to make a decision now? Or is it something that's avoidable? I don't want to have to deal with this right now. So an example of forced would be, like a forced option would be, let's say if you've ever been on a toll road, you get to a toll booth, the decision, like, are you going to throw the money in? Or are you going to try and go for it and go through the toll booth and not pay? let's assume there's no like easy pass or something like that. Are you going to go through the toll booth and, maybe the sheriff will come after me, maybe they won't? Is that decision forced? There, the toll booth is forced, or is it avoidable? If you've ever downloaded an app, especially a free one, say on your phone, probably a box will pop up eventually that says, hey, rate our app. And there'll be a couple of options. Rate it, not right now, or never ask me this again. And I'm going to venture to guess that unless you're really, really enjoying the app, in which case that is a living option. If it's a dead option for you, even if it's like you're using an app that you like, but you're like, I'm not going to rate this thing, I'm not going to make a rating about it, then that option is avoidable. Never bother me with this again, or you just keep clicking later. It might be your alarm clock going off in the morning. Let's say you have to get to work at 8 o'clock, but you set your alarm for 5:30 in the morning. Most of those first snoozes maybe are avoidable. But if you have to be at work at a certain time, and your alarm clock is going off 15 minutes before, and you live more than 15 minutes away, all of a sudden that becomes a forced option that's live for you if you want to keep your job. And then the third set or filter is the distinction between it being momentous, like this is a really big deal, this is a game changer, this will affect your life and the way that you live, or is it trivial? That is, the word trivial goes back to a notion of medieval liberal arts. That is to say, something's trivial if it relates to the trivium, which, if memory serves, is rhetoric, grammar, and arithmetic. If memory serves, that could be part of the quadrivium, because I'm doing that off the cuff. But just what trivial means is just like super basic. Like something is basic if it involves like, how many sides does a triangle have? I guess I'll have to go to the encyclopedia or Wikipedia for that. No, that's basic stuff that everybody knows. So is it something that, you're going to come down on, but is it obvious? Or is it something that's really, really going to matter and change your life for the rest of your life? That would be a momentous option. And so what he says here is that a genuine option, something that's really real, decision that you have to come down on, something that really affects your life, something that you have to really think about, is when you are entertaining an option that is living, it means something to you. Forced, you've got to deal with it now. And momentous, it is going to change your life. And this is the most important thing already. We're already, 2 pages into James. This is the most important aspect of James's thesis here. That here are the 3 sets of filtration when we're talking about options and what a genuine option is. So, for example, James says a living option is one which both hypotheses are live ones. So that would be a living option. Like, if you're stuck between 2 choices, does it matter to you? So if someone says to you, as he says, be a theosophist, which was kind of like a sort of a mystical, intellectual movement in the 19th century. Be a theosophist or be a Mohammedan. That's a 19th century term for a Muslim. Like, be a theosophist, be a Muslim. It's probably a dead option. Anybody in here intrigued by being a theosophist? Probably not. Anybody intrigued by being Muslim? Probably more likely than being a theosophist, but probably no one here is going to say that that's an option for them. Like, I don't know any of those things, it doesn't really matter for me. Probably dead. Because for you, neither hypothesis is likely to be alive. But if I say, be an agnostic, be someone who says, I don't know if God exists or not, or be a Christian, that probably matters for you more. It's otherwise. Trained as you are, each hypothesis makes some appeal, however small, to your belief. So since you live in an environment where agnosticism, atheism, Christianity is probably more familiar to you, that's going to be more of a live option. Then, he says, imagine, next if I say to you, choose between going out with your umbrella or without it, I do not offer you a genuine option, for it is still not forced. You can easily avoid it by not going out at all. If you're going to go out with your umbrella or not, I'm not going to leave. So it's not a forced option. It's not something that I must do. And that's that second notion where he says, filter number 1, living or dead. Filter number 2, forced or avoidable. If I tell you, take your umbrella out or don't, or I could stay at home, I do not offer you a genuine option, for it's not forced. You can easily avoid it by not going out at all. Similarly, if I say either love me or hate me, either call my theory true or call it false, your option is avoidable. So if someone says, you either love me or you don't, no comment. I'm not forced to choose one or the other, even if someone says that I must. Say my theory is true or say it's false. Well, it has some merits and in some respects. Well, I'm not saying it's true or false. I don't have to come down one way or the other. That's not a forced option. It's avoidable. Your option is avoidable, as he says, clearly. You may remain indifferent to me, neither loving nor hating, but you may decline to offer any judgment as to my theory. But if I say either accept this truth or go without it, I put on you a force option. Either believe what I'm saying or don't worry about it at all. I'm not going to worry about it. Oh, now I have to choose. So putting that kind of either or on it makes it a forced option. I put on you a forced option, for there is no standing place outside of the alternative. Every dilemma based on a complete logical disjunction, that is, it has to be one way or the other, with no possibility of not choosing, is an option of this forced kind. And he says, finally, if I were Dr. Nansen and proposed to you to join my North Pole expedition, your option would be momentous. Like, let's go to the North Pole. 4, this would probably be your only similar opportunity, and your choice now would either exclude you from the North Pole, sort of immortality altogether, or put at least the chance of it into your hands. He who refuses to embrace a unique opportunity loses the prize as surely as if he tried and failed. Per contra, that is, through against it, the option is trivial when the opportunity is not unique, when the stake is insignificant, or when the decision is reversible if it later prove unwise. Such trivial options abound in the scientific life. A chemist finds a hypothesis live enough to spend a year in its verification. He believes it to that extent, but if his experiments prove inconclusive either way, he is quit for his loss of time, no vital harm being done. It will facilitate our discussion if we keep all these distinctions well in mind. So here, the third filter, the momentous versus the trivial, like, is this something that's going to matter? So if I, like the example he gave, let's go to the North Pole, probably something you're not going to do. So if you do this, it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a big change. But if you don't do it, that's lost. That's what makes something momentous. Trivial, on the other hand, if I say, hey, let's have class on Tuesday. Now, that might be momentous right now. But if I said, let's get together and meet in class, that's something that we'd be doing anyway. It's not that big of a deal. It'd be kind of like if I say, hey, you know what? I'm going to take everyone out to this restaurant you've probably never been to. It's kind of a big deal. It's a well-known restaurant, but I'm going to take you out to McDonald's. Trivial option, not momentous. And so these 3 filters, or these 3 levels, come together if it's the first option in all. That is, if we go back to it, if it's living, if it's forced, and if it's momentous, that's a genuine option, which is to say, that's something that's a big deal. That's all that James is saying at this point. Moving on to section 2, this is on page 195. James says, the next matter to consider is the actual psychology of human opinion. When we look at certain facts, it seems as if our passional, that is our feelings, and our volitional, what we want to do, nature, lay at the root of all our convictions. When we look at others, it seems as if they could do nothing when the intellect had once said its say. Let us take the latter facts up first. Does it not seem preposterous on this very face of it to talk of our opinions being modifiable at will? So he's kind of picking on Clifford here a little bit, where Clifford says, if you find that you're not believing correctly, you have to force yourself into thinking rightly. That, if I'm not believing with enough evidence, I need to change my mind. James is saying here at this point, we can't really change our opinions simply because we want to. If we find ourselves, and sometimes opinions might be things that we've come to through reasons sometimes. We might have good reasons for having our opinions. But when we have, let's say, a particular proclivity, or something that we like or don't like, we can't simply change it as a matter of will. Let's say you don't like the taste of mustard. You can't just go, oh, this hot dog has mustard on it. Well, I'm just simply going to not, I'm going to change my mind and like mustard in this instance. Maybe you can tough it out. Maybe you can go, I don't like this taste, I'm going to just get through it anyway. But you can't change your opinion at will. This echoes something that Arthur Schopenhauer said. You can, where he says human beings will a lot. We can change sometimes what we like over time, but we can't change the fact that we desire certain things. We can't change our opinions at will, it doesn't seem. And let's go a little bit further. He gives the example on pages 196 and 197 of Blaise Pascal's wager for the existence of God. I don't want to get into that here, but I do want to talk about this, where he says on page 197, the talk of believing by our volition, simply a matter of will, seems then, from one point of view, simply silly. We can't simply change what we like or what we don't like. Listen to what he says here, too. Quoting Huxley here, my only consolation lies in the reflection that however bad our posterity may become, so far as they hold the plain rule of not pretending to believe what they have no reason to believe because it may be to their advantage so to pretend, they will not have reached the lowest depth of immortality. And that delicious enfant terrible, that means like basically terrifying, like terrifying child or horrible baby. Clifford writes, belief, and here he's quoting Clifford, belief is desecrated when given to unproved and unquestionable statements for the solace and private pleasure of the believer. Alright, that is, people believe things because it makes them feel good. Whoso would deserve well of his fellows in this matter will guard the purity of his belief with a very fanaticism of jealous care, lest at any time it should rest on an unworthy object and catch a stain which can never be wiped away. If a belief has been accepted on insufficient evidence, James adds, even though the belief be true, as Clifford on the same page explains, the pleasure is a stolen one. It is sinful because it is stolen in defiance of our duty to mankind. That duty is to guard ourselves from such beliefs as from a pestilence which may shortly master our own body and then spread to the rest of the town. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. That's James quoting Clifford. He continues here on page 198. All this strikes one as healthy, even when expressed, as by Clifford, with somewhat too much of a robustious pathos in the voice. That is, James is saying here, rather lightly, Clifford may be overdoing it just a tad. Free will and simple wishing do seem, on the matter of our credences, that is, our beliefs, to be only fifth wheels to the coach. Yet if anyone should thereupon assume that intellectual insight is what remains after wish and will and sentiment preference have taken wing, or that pure reason, reinen Vernunft, as Kant would say, is what then settles our opinions, he would fly quite as directly in the teeth of the facts. James is simply saying, like, we don't do it this way. That we recognize that there's what we want, what we desire, and what we feel, and then afterwards we get to the beliefs and we refine those things, and we simply only believe the best things, or only the things that we ought to believe. We don't do that. He says here, 199, James, our reason is quite satisfied in 999 cases out of every 1,000 of us, if it can find a few arguments that will do to recite in case our credulity is criticized by someone else. Our faith is faith in someone else's faith, and in the greatest matters, this is most the case. Our belief in truth itself, for instance, that there is a truth, that our minds and it are made for each other. What is it but a passionate affirmation of desire in which our social system backs us up? We want to have a truth. We want to believe that our experiments and studies and discussions must put us in continually better and better position towards it, and on this line we agree to fight out our thinking lives. But if a Pyrrhonistic, that is, a really questioning, even my own last name, which is Burris, is actually derived from this word Pyrrhus. It's the ancient Greek word for fire, and Pyrrhus was a king of Epirus. Pyrrhus was the founder of ancient skepticism, which is that you should question everything, and that you ought know everything that you can about any kind of explanatory model even if you don't agree with it, know that, and know that you're not going to know everything. That's Puritanism, ancient skepticism. Again, the Latin form of that. The Latin form of purus is burrus. That's me. So this Pyrrhonistic skepticism, this asks us how we know all this. Can our logic find a reply? Well, he's saying, what James is saying here at this point is this. If we start doing what Clifford is saying, questioning everything, you're going to find that we can't answer a lot of what we want to say. So I said earlier, for example, let's take a basic scientific claim, something like the Earth is the third planet from the Sun. Prove it. Or the one question would be, like, why do you believe that? Well, because astronomers and other kinds of scientists have told us that Earth is the third planet of the sun, from the Sun. Okay, cool. So prove it. Well, we can't really ourselves, like, it's conceivably possible we could get into a spaceship and fly around the solar system, at least hypothetically, and demonstrate that. But can we do it right now? Anyone that says the claim Earth is the third planet from the Sun, most of those people have not had a, so to speak, bird's eye view of the solar system, going up and saying, oh, yep, there it is. We don't have that, but nevertheless we can affirm it. And so James is saying, he's not saying that it's ridiculous to say that the Earth is the third planet from the Sun, or that the Earth is round, or anything like that. But if we have those beliefs, we actually, while we can appeal to the faith of others, that is the belief of others, we don't have an absolute apodictic certainty in this regard. We kind of take it on faith that the experts, what the experts have declared, is the case, and we kind of assimilate that for ourselves, and that's what we do very much of the time. So when Clifford was talking about that ship in his example and saying that, Clifford's ship owner knew this, that, or the other, James is saying here at this point, well, sometimes the affirmations that we make, they need not be ridiculous. Okay, they need not be the case that we say, something, obviously we have something flying in our face. Let's say we've got a fever, we've got a headache, we've got all kinds of disastrous symptoms, and we say, no, we're perfectly healthy. Sure, that's ridiculous. But if we have a kind of assessment about something, like, let's say, a couple weeks ago, the yellow is all out on the cars. That's tree pollen, which human beings are actually not allergic to. However, there's a lot of concomitant allergens that are in the air at the time. So that yellow pollen's out. We're sneezing a lot. Oh, do you have the flu? Do you have bird flu, avian flu, SARS, COVID-19? I think I'm just having an allergic reaction. That's why I'm sneezing. Well, you're not a doctor. How could you make such an assessment? You can't, but it seems to be reasonable to make that claim, even that we have no evidence for it. And actually, in the earliest pages of this, William James actually quoted David Hume. David Hume says, we do this all the time. We make these kind of inductive and sometimes pseudo-inductive judgments. Often, we believe things because someone else believes it, and we hold esteem in their methodology. We do this with science all the time. We may not be scientists, but we know that, hey, so-and-so said this, I'm going to trust what they said on the matter. Okay, and we have reasons for doing so. So say when it comes to, say, something like Newtonian physics, like let's say Newton's third law of motion, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Well, how do you know? Well, it seems to bear out most of the time, unless we're talking about quantum mechanics, okay, or subatomic physics, where things work, it seems, a bit differently. We're not talking about subatomic physics. It seems like Newton stuff, it holds water most of the time, so to speak. So we can affirm Newton's methodologies, formulations, and laws insofar as they go, because he had the wherewithal to dole them out. Even though we need not be Newton ourselves. Neither need we put on lab coats and start performing experiments. It's not as though every time a scientist makes some sort of scientific claim that every single person on the planet needs to do something to confirm it. Well, let's prove this, because we're not all scientists. Similarly, we do this with, like, say, nutrition a lot. So something has a bunch of fat in it, or it has a bunch of saturated fat, or it has a bunch of calories. All right, if the experts are saying that this is the case, let's come to terms with that. Even though we ourselves are not the experts, We put our trust, that is, our faith, in the expertise of others very often. Now, sometimes we can be more or less skeptical of this. Sometimes I think this is harmful. So people that are skeptical of, say, vaccines, or people that I've seen that are, don't tread on me when it comes to social distancing right now. Like, no, it's better if we just, share all the immunity together. I'm not relying on your expertise because I think it shows that you don't know what you're talking about. But if it has been demonstrated, we can more or less agree on the expertise of others, even if we be amateurs on the subject, because we can trust in the expertise of others. That does not mean that the experts are infallible or never wrong, but that we have good reasons for thinking so. And that's what James is getting at. Sometimes we believe things, or we ourselves, we are not privy to the evidence. So, like when we're talking about things like, which planet is the farthest from the sun. I mentioned earlier, Saturn is 7 AUs away. That is an astronomical unit, and the solar system is 93 million miles. The sun is 1 AU away from Earth. It's 93 million miles away from the Earth pretty constantly. I think it's a little bit less than that, like 92 point something million miles away from the Earth. And that Saturn is purportedly 7 times more than that. Well, how do I know that? I haven't gone and taken a tape measure and gone to Saturn. How could I possibly say that? Well, astronomers have concluded this, and based on the measurements of Saturn's location relative to the sun, relative to where it is in the sky, I can kind of confirm that and see if that makes sense, but I don't have the direct expertise to make that claim. So what James is saying here is sometimes we believe things rightly without having all the evidence at our disposal. But this is not the same thing as people like watching, like a trial on television saying that, oh, so-and-so, the defendant, he's guilty. You are not privy to all the evidence, and that stuff can still be in kind of dispute. I see this sometimes happen when court cases become popular. Is someone guilty or not guilty? If you're not on the jury and you're not the judge, you should probably keep your mouth shut, because you are not as privy to as much of the information. You're not privy to the facts at hand. Scientists are pretty good at least demonstrating what the facts are. I'd say lawyers less so. But that's at least what James is saying here. He also says, as a rule, we disbelieve all facts and theories for which we have no use. Clifford's cosmic emotions find no use for Christian feelings. Huxley belavers the bishops because there is no use for sacerdotalism in his scheme of life. That is the intercession of priests. Okay? That is literally the gifts of the priests is what sacerdotalism is. What he's saying here is this, is that people like Clifford and Huxley that I mentioned before, they don't like religion because they have no use for it. It's not a living option for them because they're, in James's mind, at best agnostics, at worst atheists. So obvious for the atheist, if you tell an atheist, like, hey, I'm praying for you, that means nothing for me. Now, I've seen cases where the sentiment might be nice. So, like, a Christian or a believer of some kind of religion says to a non-believer or an atheist, hey, I'm praying for you. An atheist can say, like, I know the intent by that means they're thinking about me. I'm cool with that. That's a kind sentiment. I don't believe it's doing anything, but it's a kind sentiment. James is saying here often that when people get so dogmatized in their beliefs that we often can't really see past it. Let's move forward. Skipping the mention of telepathy. Consider this, Section 4. Our next duty, having recognized this mixed-up state of affairs, is to ask whether it be simply reprehensible and pathological, or whether, on the contrary, we must treat it as if a normal element is making up our minds. Like, how do we come to the decisions that we make, not when it comes to action, but when it comes to belief, which is kind of a type of action. The thesis I defend is briefly stated this, or thusly: our passional, that is, our emotive or emotional nature, not only lawfully may, but must, decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot, by its nature, be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say, under such circumstances, do not decide, but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision. So if you're like, no, don't make a decision right now, that itself is kind of a decision. If you say to yourself, no, I don't have to come to terms with this right now, you just came to terms with coming to terms about it. just like deciding yes or no, and is attributed with the same risk of losing the truth. The thesis thus abstractly expressed will, I trust, soon become quite clear, but I must first indulge a bit more of preliminary work. So at this point, he's simply saying, when someone tries to say, like, no, you need to have an open mind about things. Well, when you make a claim like you should be open-minded about something, is that itself open-minded or closed-minded? If you're saying that you should have an open mind, are you closed-minded about having an open mind? And if you are, there's a sense in which there's a kind of circular reference problem there. I'm going to be closed-minded about if you say you must be open-minded, that's kind of closed-minded. That's kind of silly. What he's saying here is even our decisions about the beliefs we have are beliefs themselves that we've come to terms to, maybe more or less consciously. Okay, in this next section, James makes a distinction between ways of getting at truth, the empiricist method versus the absolutist method, that we can find things out by seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, more of the scientific method, and the absolutist way simply saying that there is truth that's out there, period. So let's take a look at this paragraph, this section. He says, "It will be observed that for the purposes of this discussion we are on dogmatic ground, I mean which leaves systematic philosophical skepticism altogether out of the account." Simply saying, let's question everything. He's saying, well, we don't do that all the time. We don't even do that most of the time. The postulate that there is truth, and that it is the destiny of our minds to attain it, we are deliberately resolving to make, though the skeptic will not make it. So if you're of the belief that there's truth out there, a skeptic can't really say that. Like, where is it? Like, here, I'm looking under my notebook. Is truth there? Where is it? It's not something that we can physically ascertain, truth itself, whether it be big T truth or little t truth. You can't really seem to find that itself. But he says, but the faith that truth exists, and that our minds can find it. So kind of an optimism that there is such a thing as truth, and we can find these things, even something like 2 + 2 = 4. If you believe that that's true, there's a sense in which you have faith in believing it. So if you believe 2 + 2 = 4, which I would assume most of you do, and I said to you, prove that 2 + 2 = 4, that becomes a much more difficult thing to do. There's a sense in which I think mathematicians can actually have good proofs for why arithmetic works, but for most of us, we kind of just take it. Like when you were memorizing multiplication tables when you were in elementary school. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9 is 81. All that kind of stuff. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 + 2 is 4. When you're memorizing all that stuff, you kind of just, you didn't really question it. You didn't say, is 2 + 2 really 4? I don't know, Mrs. Swearingen, is it? Yeah, we kind of take it on a kind of faith that what our math teachers are telling us is the case. So, but the skeptic would say, someone says, the skeptic would say 2 + 2 = 4. Does it, though? James is saying that's what the skeptic would do. We're not on board with the skeptic here. He says we may talk of the empiricist way and of the absolutist way of believing in truth. The absolutists in this matter say that we not only can attain to knowing truth, but we can know when we've attained to knowing it. All right, so the absolutist, someone says there is absolute truth out there, like, and we got it. We know this is true. Okay, there's a sense in which the absolutist almost says we can feel it or we can intuit it in some kind of way. While the empiricists think that although we may attain it, we cannot infallibly know when. Okay, so the empiricist will say we've got a lot of good data that leads us to this conclusion, but we cannot know this apodictically or absolutely. So consider like someone like Nate Silver or a pollster saying, it looks like 95% of voters will do this. We have good data to back it up. They'll do this. This is true, and they might even say this is true. This is the case. Is it absolutely true? Like, can it not be otherwise? No. We have things like in statistics, margins of error, saying here's the degree to which it could be wrong. And sometimes those margins of error can themselves be kind of duplicitous. To know is one thing, and to know for certain that we know is another. So these are two different kinds of modes of truth. That we can know that something is the case, and to know for certain that we know. So let's say, like for example, tomorrow. I believe tomorrow, that is Easter Sunday, April 12th, 2020. When you get to midday, I'm pretty sure that it calls for rain tomorrow. I don't remember the percentile. Let's say there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. And we say, okay, there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. I know there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. But if I'm not a meteorologist, I don't know the kind of certainty. Well, how am I coming to that conclusion? Okay, especially if I'm not a meteorologist, how can I come to that? That's why he's simply saying to know is one thing. Hey, the meteorologists are usually right. Sometimes they're wrong about things. And maybe it's not raining over your house, but it is raining in your area. But to know is one thing, and to know for certain is another. One may hold to the first being possible without the second, hence the empiricists and the absolutists, though neither of them is a skeptic in the usual philosophical sense of the term, show very different degrees of dogmatism, that is, the way that we proclaim that we ought to believe about things in their lives. If we look at the history of opinions, we see that the empiricist tendency has largely prevailed in science. So in sciences we talk about, what's the probability of something being the case. And rarely, occasionally I'll see a scientist today talk about something being obviously true, say something like evolution being obviously true or apodictically true, say something like Richard Dawkins saying we absolutely know that that evolutionary science is the case, or various forms of, say, evolutionary biology, we know this is the case. Well, in philosophy, the absolutist tendency has had everything its own way. So in philosophy, on the other hand, it seems like we talk about truths in general terms and saying we know this is the case, we know something like logically or mathematically true, which is a little bit different than the inductive methods of science. But it seems to be the case in philosophy the characteristic sort of happiness indeed which philosophies yield has mainly consisted in the conviction felt by each successive school or system that by it bottom certitude had been attained. Other philosophers are collections of opinions, mostly false. My philosophy gives standing ground forever. He's saying here that in philosophy, usually when a philosopher comes along, they say, of course, I'm right, all my predecessors are stupid, and that there's a certain sense in which I think this kind of carries over into science today and beliefs of others. We often, C.S. Lewis used the phrase chronological snobbery when it comes to people in the past. That we look at people in the past sometimes and go, man, those people were idiots. We're so smart today. I'm so smart now. I'm the smartest person ever. And so what we do is we end up kind of having a faith that our beliefs are correct and the beliefs of others are wrong. I've made this claim before in some of my own writings, that we sometimes, this is how we employ the word ideology sometimes, that we use the word ideology to refer to others' mistaken belief systems. Like, can you believe that others think this way? They're so wrong, they're so stupid, they're so dumb. Of course, I in my own mind am correct. That's problematic. When we have our system, a system, to be a system at all, must come as a closed system, reversible in this or that detail, perchance, but in its essential features, never. So even if we say, like, no, there's the way that I see the world, it's correct, it's open to interpretation, I'm liable to be mistaken. Even if we make those claims, often we really stick to our guns, so to speak. Page 202. Clifford tells us how sinful it is to be Christians on such insufficient evidence. Insufficiency is really the last thing they have in mind. For them, the evidence is absolutely sufficient, only it makes it the other way. They believe so completely in an anti-Christian order of the universe that there is no living option. Christianity is a dead hypothesis from the start. So, obviously, what James is saying here is that Clifford's problem with Christianity is he already doesn't believe in it, so he's never going to believe in it, so that's the claim. What James, I think, is getting at here, quite rightly, even no matter one's opinion about Christianity, is this claim that often we have predispositional commitments to things in our beliefs where we've already precluded ourselves from believing something or not. So let's say that you have maybe even a latent belief. You're not even conscious that you believe it. That there's only the physical world exists. There's only the physical world. Let's say you don't even believe this in like a hardcore way. You just think it's obvious. Like, there's only the physical world. There's only matter. Maybe there's energy, but because of the law of conservation, energy and matter are basically the same thing. And someone comes up to you and says, I saw a ghost yesterday. your immediate reaction might be, no, you didn't. You didn't see a ghost yesterday because ghosts don't exist, because ghosts are non-physical beings and only physical matter exists. So ergo, you didn't see a ghost, you idiot. Well, maybe somebody saw something and we don't know exactly what the phenomenon was because we weren't there ourselves. But James is simply saying at this point, often we dismiss or we include beliefs because they already fit into a framework that we already possess. This is simply how we go about acquiring, assimilating, agreeing with, and denying beliefs, is that we already have kind of an apparatus in place where we say, here are the things I'm going to believe and here's the things I'm going to disbelieve, and it's already predicated upon a system. You can almost think of it as an intellectual operating system. All of us kind of elect to have intellectual operating systems in place. It's kind of analogous to, I suppose, iOS or Android or Windows. And that, if you have an operating system in place, some things are incompatible with it. There's just some things, if something is designed for Linux and you're running things on Android, it may or may not necessarily work. It might not be compatible with the system. And so even if something works in another system, let's say something like, here you go. Here's a program in Apple on iOS, GarageBand. Try and make GarageBand work in Windows or in Android. You can't do it, so you say, well, GarageBand doesn't exist. No, it does exist. It just doesn't work in the system that you have. That's simply what James is saying here. There might be times when different operating systems or different intellectual operating systems allow for certain things and not for others. But the issue is that we default from the start. We kind of already have, James doesn't say this clearly, but we kind of already have a presuppositional framework in place through which we determine to elect the beliefs that we're going to believe or disbelieve when we come into contact with them. But we basically already have, sometimes someone like Slavoj Žižek, Jacques Lacan, Jean-Paul Sartre, even I think going back to Hegel, would say we already have kind of beliefs in place and a kind of a prejudicial system in place where we believe things or we don't. We see this happen a lot of times in social sciences today where people are talking about various topics. So say something like the concept of a social construct, especially when it's associated with postmodern notions. People say, oh, postmodernism is a denial of everything. There's no such thing as a social construct. People are saying that those things aren't real. People who are talking about social constructs are saying, no, these things are real existentially, but they're not ontologically real. That's a bunch of philosophical lingo that I'm not going to bore you with entirely right now. But the point simply being is that often when it comes to agreeing or disagreeing with beliefs, we're not really talking about the beliefs in isolation. We're always talking about beliefs in the context of a larger apparatus of what we already believe, and that we sometimes have proclivities, predispositions, and presuppositions, often based on our upbringing, often based on what we've elected to already believe anyway, of how we're going to incorporate new beliefs in. So, for example, if, similar to ghosts, if someone is not a Christian, and someone says to them, Jesus loves you, the non-Christian or the atheist is going to go, I don't believe that. That's it. Not only is it not living, no, that it's not true, based on the framework that one has. And it turns out, as James says, section 6 here, most of us are absolutists by instinct. Okay, we all kind of believe in our little truth systems, incorporating kind of by a matter of does this fit or not within my system, whether or not I'm going to make it come in. Right? And he name drops Aristotle and Hegel here at this point, which I think is appropriate. Section 7. One more point, small but important, and our preliminaries are done. There are two ways of looking at our duty in the matter of opinion. Remember, Clifford spent a lot of time talking about what he was saying. We have a duty to not believe anything without sufficient evidence. Here's how James talks about duty. That is, when it comes to matters of opinion, ways entirely different, and yet ways about whose difference the theory of knowledge seems hitherto to have shown very little concern. We must know the truth, and we must avoid error. Those are our duties, says James. These are our first and great commandments, as would be knowers. But they are not two ways of stating an identical commandment. They are two separable laws. To know the truth and avoid error are not one and the same. That involves basically two kinds of methods. Going, yeah, that's wrong, and on the other hand, we have to go after what is right. He says in the next paragraph is kind of an imperative. Believe truth, shun error. These we see are two materially different laws, and by choosing between them we may end by coloring differently our whole intellectual life. We may regard the chase for truth as paramount and the avoidance of error as secondary, or we may on the other hand treat the avoidance of error as more imperative and let truth take its chance. There are basically two foci that you can select between, generally speaking. Clifford, in the instructive passage which I have quoted, exhorts us to the latter course, to take avoidance of error as more important than truth having a chance. And he's saying, well, that itself is kind of an election or an opinion. And now notice James says here, I myself find it impossible to go with Clifford. Here he says it clearly. Like, Clifford's interesting. I can't get on board with this, says James. We must remember that these feelings of our duty about either truth or error are in any case only expressions of our passional life. That is, they're really reducible to feelings and emotions. Do I like this system? Do I like this explanation? If the answer is no, I do not want green eggs and ham, Sam I am, then what happens here is, even though we think of our selection of truth as simply something that we do logically, often involves our feelings. Sometimes we feel, I don't like this. Often our moral claims are sentimentalist. It's not, when we say something is wrong, often it's a way of saying, like, I don't like the way that thing makes me feel. Or when we're talking about things being morally good, what we're really saying is, I like the way that makes me feel, or that's good. But, biologically considered, our minds are as ready to grind out falsehood as veracity, and he who says better to go without belief forever than believe in a lie merely shows his own preponderant private horror of becoming a dupe. So if someone says, I'm not going to believe in anything just to make sure that I don't believe the wrong thing, that person's an idiot. That's what James just said. And we, not only can we not, we don't live our lives like that. We come down hard on our beliefs. So say something like, your personhood, your individuality, your consciousness is real. Well, can you prove your consciousness to others? Maybe by some external means, but you can't demonstrate your internal dialogue. Well, since you can't prove it, I guess it doesn't exist. And James is saying that's a silly way to think about things. We don't have such a reductionist tendency. We can't just avoid dupery in this way. So he says here on page 206. So listen. Well, of course, I agree as far as the facts will allow. Wherever the option between losing truth and gaining it is not momentous, we can throw the chance of gaining truth away. And, at any rate, save ourselves from chance of believing falsehood by not making up our minds at all till objective evidence has come. So James here is kind of, I don't think really rejecting Clifford, but saying here's a way to modify Clifford. Like there's a time when we need to recognize like when we can gain truth, and also recognize that there are times we can say, or like let me work on making sure that I'm not believing in falsehood. It's not an exact science, but it's kind of an attitude that we can have by not making up our minds at all till objective evidence has come. Maybe we don't have all the evidence right now. We have a gut feeling about something. I think this. We can still think that right now, but it would be better if we had reasons for doing so. That's all James is saying here. That we can believe things without evidence. So, for example, like why do we believe that math is true? Why do we believe that 2 + 2 = 4? Well, because math people said so. Well, why should we believe them? Well, we can still believe in those claims. Scientific claims. Okay, Earth is the third planet from the sun. Well, how do you know? We can still believe those claims, but what we need to do, where we do have a duty, is to continue to back those things up. Clifford would say, unless we have 100% evidence, we can't ever make a claim ever. James is saying here a softer claim, but he's kind of agreeing with Clifford to a degree at this point, where he thinks Clifford is too extreme, but he's saying we can believe things and we should look to back them up ourselves, but there are times we're completely justified in believing something where we don't have 100% evidence for it, knowing that others do. That's the difference. Okay, we can know that. We can know this because scientists have said so. Maybe scientists are wrong, but this is what they're saying right now. This is how they use to explain phenomena. And if we're good philosophers of science, we can sometimes critique those methodologies. Are these methods, are these systems correct? I'll be careful here that when we're talking about questioning systems, I don't mean to say that questioning is simply saying, that's dumb, that's stupid, but that to critique a system is to say, okay, here's the ways in which we're especially looking at like if you ever read a scientific case study report, methods, measures, and results. Like, are the methods legitimate? Are the measures legitimate? Are the results legitimate? We can look at those things, and then if we can say, I've evaluated the evidence, now I can come to that conclusion. Okay, because sometimes we can be mistaken, and sometimes we have to be demonstrated in our mistake. So, for example, I might have mentioned this semester too. If you look on a typical construal of the solar system, you have your Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, with Pluto as a dwarf planet. On the contemporary model, you go back in time 20 years, Pluto was the 9th planet, but it was small. Now it would be considered a dwarf planet. How did that change? Well, there are reasons why you can see that's the case, why you would say this classification no longer fits. But not only that, looking at the order, what's planet number 1? Mercury. Planet number 2 is Venus. Planet number 3 is Earth. Planet number 4 is Mars. Okay, take that. Then I ask you the question, what is the closest planet to the Earth? And if we look it up in terms of the orbit from the Sun, Venus is a little bit closer than Mars to the Earth. Mars, I want to say, is about somewhere between 2 and 3 AUs from the Earth. And AU, again, is an astronomical unit, 93 million miles. It's the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So we're the 3rd planet. Mars is the 4th planet. Venus is the 2nd planet. We're in between 2 and 4. What planet is closest to Earth? And since we're in an orbital plane, what planet is closest to the Earth most of the time? Now, the intuitive response might be, well, Venus is closer, so it's Venus. And next closest is Mars. So it's got to be, like, we're the 3rd planet, Venus is 2nd, Mars is 4th. It's got to be Venus or Mars, at least. There's no way Jupiter is the next closest planet. But it's got to be Venus or Mars. The answer to the question, according to scientists, is that the closest planet to Earth most of the time is actually Mercury. But Mercury is 2 planets away. How could this be the case? Well, if the Sun's at the center, and Mercury is very close to it going around, and then Venus doing its thing, and then Earth doing its thing, often Earth is where it is, and Venus can be on the other side of the Sun, Mars can be on the other side of the Sun, and even if Mercury is on the far side of the Sun, Mercury can still be closer than either Venus or Mars. Now, that's something that seems counterintuitive. It seems like, no, Venus or Mars should be closer, because we're dealing with geometry here, basically stellar geometry. That's what changes the features of things. That seems like it shouldn't fit, but it can be demonstrated that's the case. Simply look at a series of 8 circles going around the Sun. It's very possible that Mars is on the other side, Venus is on the other side of the Sun. That can happen. And that Mercury, even if it's on the other side of the Sun, is still closer than Venus or Mars, even though Mercury is 2 planets away in terms of the organization of the solar system. It seems like it shouldn't make sense, but we can demonstrate that's the case using math, geometry, and astronomy, even though these facts are quite independent of us. And, was that a momentous occasion? Did that change your life? Did that blow your world? Probably not, unless you're studying to be an astronomer. This is page 207. Science has organized this nervousness into a regular technique, her so-called method of verification, and she has fallen so deeply in love with the method that one may even say she has ceased to care for truth by itself at all. What James is saying here is that the scientific method sometimes gets so in love with its own method that it doesn't get at truth because it's focusing so much on the method itself as truth. And science, even though that's what James has in mind, I can think of other philosophers like Rudolf Carnap saying similar. Rudolf Carnap, Irma Lakatos, Willard Van Orman Quine, and other analytic philosophers in the 20th century, maybe Wittgenstein too to some degree, talking about various ideological or big system pictures not being able to get at things rightly because they're in love with their own technique so much. So consider like Freud. So Freudian psychoanalysis, if you're having neurotic behaviors, it's because something happened to you at your childhood that probably interrupted your oral or anal developmental phases. So if something happened to you, like if you have antisocial behavior today or some kind of neurosis, something happened to you in your childhood. Yeah, but nothing happened to me in my childhood. Well, that you can remember, you must have repressed the memories. So keeping the methodology in place, even if there are counterexamples in the world, like, no, I didn't have a bad relationship with my parents, that's not what happened. That you remember. Or Marxism being relegated as not being a science, saying, the Marxists, sometimes it's called scientific materialism, dialectical materialism. That revolution is going to happen in the most industrialized nations in the world, like Russia in 1917. That doesn't fit the model. And so what Marxist scientists would often do is say, well, that was an exception, and here's another exception, and here's another exception. And when you keep looking at exceptions and ignoring them and still sticking to kind of like a party line position, that's a kind of dogmatism. That can't be the case. That shouldn't be the case, and that's not how we should go about doing things. Consider what we've talked about this semester, ethics. Like often we think of scientific claims as really easy. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay? 16 over 4, that's the same thing as 4. Okay? Well, look at what James says here. Moral questions immediately present themselves as questions whose solution cannot wait for sensible proof. We're talking about something being right or wrong. It doesn't follow the same kind of mathematical certainty as 2 + x = 4, therefore x = 2. A moral question is a question not of what sensibly exists, but of what is good, or would be good if it did exist. Science can tell us what exists, but to compare the worths both of what science exists and what does not exist, we must consult not science, but what Pascal calls our heart. He's simply saying here that, science can get at very specific, objective things. We can talk about their description, but we really can't talk about their significance. But because when we talk about axiology, that is things that have to do with values, whether it be artistic values or moral values. We kind of just take those things as a given. And James says that can be okay. We need to recognize that that's where it comes from. The givens that we have are what lend us to the beliefs that we thereafter possess. Surely, the problem is the kind of gullibility that we fall into when we simply believe something simply because, well, everyone else has always believed it. It need not be the case. And I think at this point, that concludes what I want to say about James here and about this topic. In summation, going back to the beginning, what is an option, a genuine option for William James is that it is a living option, that it's forced and momentous. So a dead, avoidable, and trivial option, no one's going to care about. You're probably not going to even remember that such an option tomorrow. But that's where our beliefs, our strongest beliefs that we possess, our convictions, especially as adults, are going to come from. Through this process of, does this matter to me? Do I have to deal with this now? And is this a big deal? If the answer to all those 3 questions is yes, that's going to be something that changes your life, and you are going to have some very concrete beliefs about that particular item. So for you, the application is, what does it have to do with engineering ethics? When Clifford said, hey, that boat, he shouldn't have done that. The captain should have gotten it repaired. Well, now from James's perspective, what do you think we should have done? What does it have to do with something being living or dead? whether it's forced or avoidable, whether it's momentous or trivial, what do you do? If it meets all three of these criteria in the former's case, if it's living, forced, and momentous, that's a genuine option. If it's dead, avoidable, or trivial, why even bother? All right. So that concludes what I'm going to say about James right now. The piece is up on Blackboard. We'll be moving to other takes on this from some other mediums, or I guess I should say media, later this week. All right, everybody. Have a good one. Bye-bye.